Soaring energy costs are set to dominate discussions at the European Union summit. Leaders are scrambling to find a solution to curb the spikes triggered by the war on Iran. Europe is heavily reliant on energy imports, and gas prices have jumped some 60% since the conflict began. And for more, Ross Cullen is covering developments for CNA live from Brussels. Now, Ross, the EU leaders, they're discussing measures to ease energy prices. But with the Strait of Hormuz still disrupted, how realistic are these proposals in actually bringing down these costs?
Yeah, Angela, the European Union Council meeting is underway. Just over to my left here, we heard from the leaders on their way into that meeting. Emmanuel Macron saying that the attacks on energy infrastructure in the Gulf were reckless. He said everybody should calm down. The fighting should stop, at least for a few days, so negotiations could be given a chance. And the Austrian Chancellor, Christian Stocker, are saying that the European Union would not be blackmailed into joining the war on Iran, despite the fact that the European Union doesn't get a lot of its liquefied natural gas imports from Qatar. The overall impact of the attacks on energy infrastructure and also the ongoing blockade of tanker traffic in the Strait of Hormuz impact the overall global energy markets, and therefore there is an impact here in Europe. A lot of the benchmark that they use is based in the Netherlands, and that was up more than 20% in early trading in terms of the gas benchmark here in Europe overall. Most of the gas imports do come from the United States, from Norway, from Algeria, but the ongoing impact of those attacks on energy infrastructure is going to have an impact here in Europe.
And speaking of being in Europe, there appears to be divisions within the bloc right now over tools like tax cuts and also emissions rules. So how is the EU going to reconcile or overcome these differences internally?
Well, it's going to try to do what it always does, Angela, when you have 27 different presidents, prime ministers and chancellors coming together for their quarterly meeting. There are already divisions over situations such as what's going on with Hungary and Slovakia and Ukraine in terms of a damaged pipeline, the Druzhba pipeline to get oil flowing to Hungary and Slovakia. Russian oil, the only two EU states that continue to use that as a means to power their energy grids. When it comes to emissions, we have seen the French president pushing back on some of those tighter environmental targets, arguing that there needs to be a possible relaxation of some of the ambitions when it comes to green goals. So there is going to be an attempt by the European Council President, Antonio Costa. He's got a self-imposed goal of keeping these summits to one day only to try to get all of these issues, the situation with energy in the Middle East, the war in Ukraine, the overall impact of the energy crisis. We have the United Nations Secretary General here in person, the European Central Bank Chief Christine Lagarde also here in person, the Ukrainian President dialing in via a video link. So there's a lot going on. It's a very packed agenda, including discussions about tax and emissions. So there is a lot for the European Union leaders to try to chew over as they sit down for a working lunch.
Ross, thank you so much for bringing us the latest. That was Ross Cullen, covering developments live for CNA from Brussels. Now, for more on the impact and the extent of supply disruption across the Middle East, we're joined by Ed Cox, who is editor for Global LNG at ICIS, live from London. Now, Ed, let's start with the market reaction. To what extent have these recent developments actually changed the global LNG supply picture versus just pricing in higher risk or uncertainty?
Well, it's a good question. There's an immediate impact on supply. So we're talking about almost 20% of the world's LNG supply coming from Qatar and the UAE. Now that Qatar plant was taken down at the start of March. So we've seen an immediate cut, particularly to markets in South and Southeast Asia. And every day, every week, this continues, it becomes more profound. So we're seeing buyers come into the market to find replacement cargoes from Qatar, such as Bangladesh and Egypt. But globally, the key point is we're talking about 20% of LNG supply. The market simply cannot balance without that. And that's why we see these prices going to high levels, particularly after news of the attack on the Ras Laffan plant last night.
Yeah, let's talk a bit about these attacks. We've seen attacks on LNG infrastructure in Qatar and Iran. How significant are those facilities when it comes to global supply? And what is actually being impacted so far?
Yes, that is it. This is really the escalation that was of most concern. Qatar Energy overnight confirmed those fires and that damage due to Iranian attacks at Ras Laffan. So Ras Laffan, it's the biggest LNG plant in the world. It's almost 80 million tons. The question now is how material is that damage? Up to now, the question was really when will Hormuz reopen effectively? When will Qatar restart its LNG plant? Now it's moved on because these are huge, complex bits of kit and technology. They can take a long time to repair, as you can see on the pictures there. So there's considerable concern in the market that we could be talking about a longer period of plant outage there and a greater impact on supply as a result.
Yeah, let's zoom out a little bit and see how much global LNG supply has effectively been taken offline or is currently constrained at this point.
Yes, we're talking over 20 vessels load every week from Ras Laffan in Qatar, and then you've got the United Arab Emirates plant nearby. So as I mentioned, that's almost 20% of global supply, particularly impacting Asia market. EU gets about 8% of its LNG from Qatar, but this is a global story, right? Because you can't take that much LNG out of the market at once without it impacting all buyers. So we've seen prices increase across the board, Asia and Europe. It's really a question of duration. So our modeling looks 3 months, 6 months, 9 months ahead. And every week that goes by, the impact on markets becomes more significant. We see more restrictions downstream in Asia on some of their energy consumption and gas supply and demand balances. But more broadly, you mentioned Europe. You know, the further we go into this year, the further we go towards the third quarter, in particular, where you get seasonal demand spikes for gas in East Asia, particularly, you get higher demand in Europe for storage injection. Europe needs 40% of its gas is covered by LNG now. So it's becoming more acute. It's already an issue, but this is all about how long this plant is down for and the greater the impact on the market.
And speaking of Europe, are we already seeing competition intensify between Asia and Europe for these limited LNG cargoes? And how does that competition play out when it comes to pricing?
We absolutely are. You know, we're tracking these vessels on the water and we can see diversions. That Asia spot price jumped higher than the European gas price as a result, particularly cargoes from the United States, which is the biggest producer in the world of LNG. They diverted away from Europe to the Asian market. That's really a function of price signals. Now, shipping rates also went up, which is another factor to consider. But we've seen around 10 visible diversions from Europe to Asia from the US. Probably more still to come. But the market spreads are quite tight between Europe and Asia. And this is because both markets depend on LNG. And that's why prices are going to go higher. You're not going to get one market separating from the other. So that's naturally a concern for buyers, consumers, businesses in both regions.
And if we were to look at the relationship between the oil and gas markets here, to what extent are these rising oil prices feeding into gas markets? Or do you think that the LNG and oil markets still are behaving quite independently at this point?
Well, they're both bullish, as you said. They haven't moved in tandem, and they don't. They are different markets. But look, in Asia in particular, a lot of LNG is still bought linked to the price of oil, and that higher oil price will filter through over the next 3 to 6 months. So the price of oil is incredibly important, and also because markets, particularly in Asia, depend on oil and oil products as well as gas and LNG. So having both curtailed at the same time makes it particularly challenging. So we're also bullish on the outlook for oil pricing. It's a very similar narrative. It depends on the duration of Hormuz being down, nature of damage to infrastructure, and the extent of how long the conflict continues for.
Ed, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. That was Ed Cox, editor for Global LNG at ICIS.